Okay, welcome back. Last lecture on the symbolic universe, although it's going to be with us for the rest of the course. Main takeaway from this lecture, this is going to be just a summary of kind of where we've been, is that the symbolic universe defines reality for the people who step into it. We talked about at the very beginning, the symbolic universe is defined as the collection of all the symbols in a society. And what we've done since then is kind of enumerated most of the symbols, at least good enough for an intro to sociology course, most of the symbols that we need to understand in order to kind of make the course work, but it's most of the symbols that you're ever going to encounter in your life as well, most of the types. So we've got that. It's the collection of all the symbols in a society. The sort of crucial philosophical point to this is that it defines reality for us. The way you understand reality depends on the particular machine that you step into, and really the machine that you're raised in. And we talked about this with regard to the Inuits up in northern Canada, that they experience reality. They understand and experience reality differently than we do, with all the different types of snow that they can perceive. There are things that we can't perceive. Reality is different for them because they step into and were raised in a different machine than we are. Given that, it's also important to understand that we live our lives in terms of this particular symbolic universe. This is the reality. This is, to go back to the Matrix example that I used a long time ago, this is the code that is everywhere on everything. The code is different if you're in a different society. And the code, we can't live without it. Although I will make the argument that you absolutely, once you understand it, you can make the choice to defy it. Let's see, we live our lives in terms of it. The two quotes that are on the syllabus, one from Karl Marx about you don't get to pick the circumstances. The symbolic universe is some of those circumstances that you didn't get to pick. You live your life in a world that defines reality in a particular way. Your life would be different if your society defined reality differently. These are some of those circumstances that even though you get to live your life the way you want, you don't get to pick the parameters. You don't get to pick the circumstances within which you live that life. It is, as the Marshall McLuhan quote said, a fish wouldn't understand the water. That's the last thing that they would understand. The symbolic universe is largely hidden to us, right? I mean, before we started talking about it, the detail in which we've talked about the fact that everything is a thing that holds meaning, particularly people, that we interact with ideas rather than the reality of the individual. Stuff that most of us, because we're so good at making meaning, most of us don't really reflect on. That is it. Last point for this quick summary. Marshall McLuhan talks about a fish would never be able to conceptualize an anti-environment that would let them reflect on the water. They couldn't think about, so what would it be like if I wasn't in water? Well, it probably bears a little bit of thinking on our part about how would life be different if we lived in a different reality, a reality that defined men differently than we define men, that defined women differently than we define women, that defined races differently than we define races. And those are just examples of social locations. That it defined the ecosystem in which we live differently than we do, which tends to be kind of an inert setting that exists for us to make use of. We could define the ecosystem differently. So what would life be like? And I guess the last point about this is that even though I've made the point that you step into this and this is just what is natural to you, now that you know, it doesn't have to be anymore. I'm not saying disregard stop signs. I'm saying consider the ways in which this particular symbolic universe doesn't lead to your happiness. Remember, we talked about last time the fact that your happiness is dependent on the ideas you have about yourself. Those are thoughts that were produced by society, right? By other people. It's worth thinking about the fact that our symbolic universe is not flawless. No symbolic universe is. I'm not saying we should go back to being hunter-gatherers. I'm not saying we should become Inuit. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying that the way we make progress is by thinking about, okay, so what in the way our machine is set up leads to suffering? And are there ways in which we could change that? Now, unfortunately, we aren't going to talk about the mechanisms of social change until way at the end of the semester. But for right now, it's worth thinking about the fact that it doesn't have to be this way. This symbolic universe is not inevitable. And to the extent it's not inevitable, and certainly to the extent that it leads to suffering, it's probably worth thinking about the fact that you always have, this little person over here, always has agency, the capacity to say, I hear what you're saying, I don't think that's right, I'm going to do something else. It's not easy, and people a lot of the time get upset when you do that. But, you know, these are people who've been brainwashed just like we have, to think this is reality, when really this is a version of reality. All right, deep stuff to think about, but worth thinking about. You can post about it in discussion boards, you can reflect on it, you can email me personally, whatever you want to do. But I would suggest giving it at least a little bit of thought, because your life turns out differently if you have a different symbolic universe. All right, that's it for the symbolic universe. We will move on to this quadrant next time, which is, instead of where symbols live, it's where beliefs live. It's going to be a component we're going to call the collective consciousness, which sounds kind of menacing, but it's not that bad. I will see you in that video.